concept of anti-resilience. She points out that resilience in an energy system can actually deepen structural inequality, and it could exacerbate vulnerability. So what she's saying, almost in opposition to what the engineering definition of reliable electricity that I provided gives, she's talking about how if you harden the existing system, you might not get out a different outcome. And this is what my research is looking at. Are we doing anything different with the billions of disaster recovery funds? Or are we doing what Shalonda Baker has theorized in these papers? Are we just making the problem more entrenched? So moving on from from resilience into recovery, here's the current status in Puerto Rico. In terms of spending, in the 5 years since Hurricane Maria hit in September 2017, it's been called one of the most complicated and expensive disasters in US history. The electric grid recovery alone is valued at $9.4 billion. It has been analyzed to be the largest allocations of disaster recovery funds from the federal government through the agency of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So in those 5 years, and the total of all of the disaster recovery for Hurricane Maria and specific to Puerto Rico is $28 billion. That includes housing and other aspects of public structures. Out of that 28 billion, only 40.3 million has been spent for permanent electricity recovery. And that is just a little more than 1/10 of a percent. It's insignificant, and it's taken 5 years to get to this point. So the people of Puerto Rico haven't really seen recovery when it comes to dollars and cents, and they have neither seen recovery when it comes to actual operation of the electricity system. And I've given you a lot of words, and I want to sort of rest on this picture for a little bit. Imagine that your community faced something like this. No power lines, no access to the roads, hurricanes of these types that are happening repeatedly and that the people of Puerto Rico are dealing with. Like, this is so much larger than just the electricity system. These storms dramatically alter daily life. So when we're talking about the response, here's some of what FEMA has done differently in Puerto Rico. When I began to look at this research, I was really interested to see that Puerto Rico has launched a new sampling method. So when trying to approve projects for the recovery faster, they don't review all of them. They're looking at a sample, and they're doing this to accelerate projects. And they've also changed how they estimate costs. But one of the issues with how they're estimating costs based on fixed cost, fixed labor, fixed material costs, is that those don't stand up to inflation. And they also are looking at the previous design of a facility. So if you had a coal plant, you're looking at the fixed costs for replacing a coal plant design. You're not looking at how to improve the infrastructure. And what that leads to is more fragile infrastructure that's likely to be harmed by the next storm. The next thing that they did is that the Puerto Rican government opted for what's called an alternative procedure, which is allowed through FEMA and their public assistance program for electricity improvements. Now, what this does is it just changes the process. So it's another difference from how FEMA typically operates to how it's responding in Puerto Rico. Now, these changes are all meant in good faith, I think, but what they do when combined together is create a gap. And that gap, I believe, rests on resilience and not taking up that opportunity. So here's a flow chart that I designed through my research that shows the anticipated flow of disaster funds. And as you can see, there's a lot of bubbles. There are a lot of people touching this amount of money. And that means that there's a lot of different perspectives and a lot of opportunities for delay. So at the top, you'll see green, and that green is government agencies that are managing the money before it gets to the orange, which is the government of Puerto Rico and several other groups and institutions that are required for what the federal government calls oversight, but in many ways has become a deterrent and or a major obstacle to getting projects proposed and getting projects completed when it comes to time. So Core 3, PREB, the P3 Authority, PREPA, and LUMA are all Puerto Rican organizations, and they all are involved in the review process. This is a lot to get through, and it is so different than how many other states and communities manage their disaster recovery. And what I've seen is that this type of process, it has not done what it intended to do for the people of Puerto Rico. And I question if this will actually lead to a more improved grid. So when we're thinking about all this information together, does this response from FEMA actually mean resilience? While all of these groups are reviewing the proposals for electric grid recovery, so new power generation, improved grid substations, there's also some other post-disaster guidelines that are provided by the federal agency that lack rigor. So what I was saying earlier about FEMA doing things different in Puerto Rico, another thing they did is that in April 2019, FEMA reduced project review. They're doing this, again, to increase flexibility and expedite the funds, but what actually has happened is not an increase in a more reliable grid. So you're incentivizing something different because the electricity grid is still 97% petroleum based. So when I looked closer, what I realized is that there were a lot of good intentions by Congress and the president that have turned into the removal of resilience incentives. So the laws that govern disaster recovery, namely the Stafford Act, default to a 75% cost share, meaning the government through FEMA will pay 75% of the costs to recover the approved electricity grid damaged facilities. But at the president's discretion, they can raise it to 85% of the cost if there are resilience activities in the proposals. Now, what happened in Puerto Rico is that Congress and the president raised the federal cost share to 100%. So they're paying for everything, whether or not there's resilience improvements in the plans. And while that's ethical because of Puerto Rico's debt crisis situation, it created a sort of vacuum. Why and when would people choose to actually add more resilience to their project when they can just replace what was already there for the lowest cost and still get 100% of the cost without having to seek private investment? And in my policy analysis, I saw this from Senators Menendez, Booker, and others who are talking about increasing the cost share. This is that press release. And the same thing a few years later from Senator Schumer and Representative Velasquez, who are identifying that, yes, there's a higher cost share. And by the way, government of Puerto Rico, you can use this money from the federal government for renewables, which was an argument by the companies that came into Puerto Rico that said, you have to replace what was there before. So what we have with Puerto Rico is an island that is mostly powered by fossil fuels and a major opportunity to take billions of dollars in disaster funds and turn that into a major investment to increase the investment from the private sector and the nonprofit sector and totally redo the grid. Now, this is what Congress is saying. You can do that. You can take your vision and use this money to do something new. And myself, my mentors and a lot of the people that I've read about and worked with in Puerto Rico requested this study at Congress. So I'm very proud of this and the ability to clear the air that the funds could be used on renewables. So in terms of taking action, very quickly in the last few moments, I wanted to share that the Department of Energy has a new team that's focused on the modernization of the Puerto Rican grid. It was just introduced in November 2022, a few short months ago, and they are looking at how to act on recent scientific findings from the national labs on Puerto Rican renewable energy opportunities. So I am going to be taking the research that I've done and will continue to do to this team to talk about how more stringent disaster recovery incentives policies could advance resilience in Puerto Rico and in other places, and how by choosing to invest in electricity system resilience, we could also be reducing the amount of taxpayer dollars that would be needed in the future as these hurricanes continue to hit the island. Again, the methods I'm using are secondary content analysis, looking at documents and the historical records, and the output will be a policy memo that I will be delivering on March 6th to DC in person, to this team members of this Puerto Rican Department of Energy team, and to congressional committees. So we'll be discussing the opportunities for resilience and the ways that these funds could be used different and could perhaps lead towards improvements in places outside of Puerto Rico as well. So now I'm ready for your questions.
Oh my goodness, we've got the right person here. I do have a question to start with while you're getting yours together. So Puerto Rico as a state,
Not a state.
do they?
It's a territory.
Yes, but would they like to be? Would they like to be a state?
They've had several votes.
Voted against it.
And the votes have come under scrutiny.
Political.
There's some people who would like to, and there's others who do not. And one thing that my mentors have really reminded me about is that the issue of nationalism and the issue of a reliable grid are very separate, specifically because the nationalist principles are, some people try to tie the two together. So it's somewhat dangerous, but I would say that similar to issues that we face in the United States, there is a significant amount of disagreement around the path, whether it's as an independent country, state, whether it's a state of the United States or something else.
Nancy Coors.
I have two questions. Number one is the $9.4 billion a yearly allotment to Puerto Rico?
No, it's essentially just the recovery funds in response to one disaster. And the reason why that's scary is that this has happened multiple times already.
Yeah.
And what that means for the country is that not just in Puerto Rico, but in anywhere the US is facing a disaster, we could be spending this many billions of dollars to do the same thing over and over again.
Yeah. And my second question is why hasn't there been a push for solar power rather than gas and oil, which is horrible?
Yeah.